Sarah Chun had learned long ago that first impressions could be deadly weapons. As she stepped off the military transport vehicle at Naval Base Coronado, her worn civilian clothes and simple backpack made her look like just another young recruit fresh out of basic training. The scorching California sun beat down on her face as she surveyed the sprawling base that would become her new battlefield. Though none of the personnel rushing past her had any idea, they were looking at one of the youngest admirals in naval history. She had specifically requested this assignment under an assumed identity, trading her admiral stars for anonymity. What she discovered in the next few weeks would either restore her faith in the military she devoted her life to, or shatter everything she believed about honor, loyalty, and justice. Little did she know that Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb and his crew of corrupt officers had been running their own private empire within these walls for years, and they saw every new arrival as either a potential ally or a threat to be eliminated. Sarah's mission was simple: go undercover, gather evidence, and clean house. But when Webb and his followers decided the quiet new girl needed to learn her place, they made the fatal mistake of targeting someone who had been commanding fleets while they were still learning to tie their boots. This is the story of how they tried to break her, and how she dismantled their entire operation piece by piece, revealing that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sarah Chin kept her expression neutral as she walked through the main gates of Naval Base Coronado for the first time as seaman recruit Sarah Mills. The fake identity felt strange on her tongue, but she had practiced it enough times that it rolled off naturally now. At 28, she was older than most new recruits, but her story was solid. A college graduate who had finally decided to serve her country after working dead-end jobs for years. The base buzzed with activity as morning drills commenced across various training grounds. Sarah observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had been evaluating military installations for over a decade, though she kept her analysis hidden behind the wide-eyed curiosity expected of a newcomer. The base was impressive by any standard, but she could already spot several security weaknesses and operational inefficiencies that would need addressing once her mission was complete. Her temporary quarters were in Building C, a stark concrete structure that housed new personnel awaiting permanent assignment. As she climbed the stairs to the third floor, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, Sarah mentally reviewed the intelligence briefings that had brought her here. For the past 18 months, naval intelligence had been receiving reports of irregularities at Coronado, missing supplies, altered duty rosters, and whispered complaints about favoritism and corruption that never seemed to make it through official channels. The reports weren't enough to launch a formal investigation, but they were troubling enough that Admiral Patricia Morrison, Sarah's mentor and one of the few people who knew her true identity, had suggested this unconventional approach. Sarah had volunteered immediately, partly because she was between major assignments and partly because she had grown up in military bases just like this one. She knew how toxic leadership could poison an entire command structure, and she had seen good sailors destroyed by corrupt superiors who thought themselves untouchable. Her room was small but functional: a single bed, a metal desk, and a narrow locker that would hold her few possessions. As she unpacked, Sarah carefully placed her civilian clothes in the locker while keeping her military-issue items visible. Hidden in a secret compartment of her duffel bag were her real identification papers and a secure communication device that would allow her to contact Morrison when necessary. Everything else about seaman recruit Mills had been carefully constructed by naval intelligence to withstand scrutiny. A knock on her door interrupted her unpacking. Sarah opened it to find a young woman about her own age, wearing the uniform of a petty officer second class. The woman had short blonde hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You must be the new girl," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Petty Officer Lisa Rodriguez. I heard we had fresh meat arriving today." Sarah shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of real work. "Sarah Mills, nice to meet you. First time on a base this size?" Rodriguez asked, leaning against the doorframe with casual confidence. "Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming," Sarah replied, allowing a hint of nervousness to creep into her voice. "I'm supposed to report to personnel at 0800 tomorrow for assignment." Rodriguez nodded. "Word of advice, keep your head down and your mouth shut until you figure out how things work around here. This place has its own rules, if you know what I mean." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Rodriguez glanced down the hallway, and her expression shifted slightly. "Speaking of which, here comes trouble." 3 men in uniform were walking down the corridor, their voices carrying clearly in the enclosed space. The man in the center wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander and carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his uniform was immaculate, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's instincts prickle with warning. "That's Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb," Rodriguez said quietly. "He runs the operations division, and he thinks he runs everything else too. The guys with him are his personal fan club, Lieutenant Thompson and Petty Officer Jenkins. My advice: stay off their radar." Webb's conversation with his companions was loud enough to be clearly heard as they approached. "I'm telling you, the new supply contracts are a gold mine. We just need to make sure the right people are handling the paperwork." "What about the audit scheduled for next month?" asked the man Rodriguez had identified as Thompson. "Don't worry about it," Webb replied with a dismissive wave. "I've got contacts in Norfolk who owe me favors. The audit will find exactly what we want it to find." Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she processed what she was hearing. In her years of naval service, she had dealt with corruption before, but it never failed to anger her when she saw officers betraying the trust placed in them. She forced herself to maintain the wide-eyed expression of an overwhelmed recruit. Webb noticed the two women standing by Sarah's open door, and his eyes lingered on Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Well, what do we have here?" "This is Sarah Mills, sir," Rodriguez said, her tone carefully respectful. "She just arrived for assignment." Webb stepped closer, and Sarah caught the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the particular combination of arrogance and entitlement that she had learned to recognize in corrupt officers. "Mills, is it? Where are you from, Mills?" "Phoenix, sir," Sarah replied, remembering her cover story. "I worked in retail before deciding to enlist." "Retail?" Webb repeated, his smile not reaching his eyes. "How quaint. Well, Mills, let me give you some free advice. This base operates on respect and hierarchy. You show proper respect to your superiors, and you'll do fine. You cause problems." He let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. "I'm not here to cause problems, sir," Sarah said, injecting just the right amount of nervousness into her voice. "I just want to serve my country." Webb laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Serve your country. That's cute. You'll learn soon enough that idealism doesn't keep you warm at night or put food on your table." He turned to his companions. "Come on, gentlemen. We have business to discuss." As the three men continued down the hallway, their voices fading, Rodriguez shook her head. "See what I mean? Webb thinks this base is his personal kingdom, and he treats everyone else like subjects." "What did he mean about idealism?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Rodriguez glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Let's just say that Webb and his crew have figured out ways to make military service more profitable than the government intended. They control most of the good assignments, the supply chains, even the duty rosters. If you're not in their inner circle, you get the worst jobs and the longest shifts. Doesn't anyone ever complain?" "To who?" Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Webb has connections all the way up the chain of command. The last person who tried to file a formal complaint ended up transferred to a weather station in Alaska. After that, people learned to keep quiet and hope for the best." Sarah filed this information away, her anger growing despite her efforts to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of systemic corruption that destroyed military units from within. Good sailors became demoralized and left the service, while those willing to compromise their integrity were rewarded and promoted. "Thanks for the warning," Sarah said. "I'll be careful." Rodriguez studied her face for a moment. "You seem different from most recruits. More mature, I guess. Just remember, in places like this, being smart can be as dangerous as being stupid if you're not careful about how you show it." After Rodriguez left, Sarah closed her door and sat on her narrow bed, processing everything she had observed in her first few hours on the base. Webb's casual discussion of fraudulent contracts and corrupted audits was more blatant than she had expected. Most corrupt officers were at least subtle about their activities, but Webb seemed to operate with complete impunity. She opened her laptop and began typing what appeared to be a casual email to a college friend, but which was actually an encrypted report to Admiral Morrison. Using code phrases they had established during her briefing, Sarah described her arrival and initial observations. The corruption appeared to be more extensive than intelligence had suspected, and Webb's confidence suggested he had protection at higher levels. As she finished her report, Sarah heard voices in the hallway outside her room. She cracked the door open slightly and saw Webb returning with his two companions. They had been joined by several other personnel, both officers and enlisted, and their conversation had the tone of a business meeting. "The next shipment arrives Thursday," Webb was saying. "I want everything diverted through the secondary warehouse before it goes into the official inventory. Thompson, you'll handle the paperwork modifications." "What about the new personnel assignments?" asked a voice Sarah didn't recognize. "We'll evaluate them case by case. Anyone who looks like trouble gets assigned to the worst details until they either fall in line or request transfer. Anyone who shows potential gets brought into the fold gradually." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists as she listened to Webb casually discussing how he would manipulate duty assignments to protect his operation. This wasn't just theft or fraud. It was a systematic abuse of military authority that affected every honest sailor on the base. "Speaking of new personnel," Webb continued, "keep an eye on that recruit Mills in room 314. Something about her doesn't sit right with me." "You want us to run a background check?" Thompson asked. "Already ordered one through unofficial channels," Webb replied. "But, in the meantime, make sure she gets assigned to the worst details we have available. Night shifts, equipment cleaning, anything that will keep her busy and miserable. If she's smart enough to be a problem, we'll break her down before she gets ideas." Sarah closed the doors silently, her mind racing. Webb's instincts were sharper than she had hoped. She would need to be extremely careful to maintain her cover while gathering the evidence needed to bring down his operation. The fact that he was already suspicious meant she had limited time before he might discover her true identity. She returned to her laptop and sent another coded message to Morrison, alerting her to the accelerated timeline. Then, she lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling, planning her next moves. Tomorrow would bring her first official day as Seaman Recruit Mills, and she suspected that Lieutenant Commander Webb was going to make it as difficult as possible. But Webb had made a crucial error in judgment. He saw Sarah as a potential threat to be neutralized, when in reality, she was a carefully placed weapon designed to destroy everything he had built. His attempts to break her down would only provide more evidence of his corruption, and his confidence would make him careless. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself almost looking forward to the morning. She had spent years commanding from the top of the hierarchy, but there was something appealing about the challenge of fighting from the bottom. Webb thought he could intimidate and control her because he saw only a young recruit with no power or connections. He had no idea that he was about to face an opponent who had been trained in strategy and tactics at the highest levels, someone who understood military systems better than he ever would, and who had the full backing of naval intelligence. His first attempt to put her in her place would be the beginning of his own downfall. The base settled into nighttime quiet around her, but Sarah's mind remained active, analyzing every detail of what she had observed and planning for the challenges ahead. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of her campaign to expose and eliminate the corruption that was poisoning this command. Webb and his allies were about to learn that they had made the worst mistake of their military careers when they decided to target the new girl who looked so harmless and vulnerable. In the darkness of her small room, Sarah Chun smiled with quiet anticipation. The game was about to begin, and her opponents had no idea what they were up against as Sarah's alarm buzzed at 0530. But she had been awake for 20 minutes already, her internal clock still programmed to Admiral's hours despite her recruit persona. She dressed quickly in her crisp uniform, checked her appearance in the small mirror above her sink, and made sure every detail projected the image of an eager new sailor ready to serve. The personnel office was located in the base's main administrative building, an imposing structure that housed most of the command functions. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early and waited in the small anteroom with 3 other new arrivals who had come in on different transports throughout the week. The conversation was typical for nervous recruits, speculation about assignments, worry about making good impressions, and excitement about finally beginning their military careers. Sarah participated just enough to seem normal while carefully observing the personnel moving through the building. She could already identify several of Webb's associates from the previous evening, and she noticed how other sailors seemed to unconsciously avoid them in the corridors. It was the kind of behavioral pattern that developed when people learned to fear certain individuals, and it told her more about the toxic environment than any briefing could have. At exactly 0800, a chief petty officer emerged from the inner office and called the 4 new arrivals inside. Chief Martinez was a compact man in his 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he had seen more than his share of military politics. He gestured for them to sit in chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Welcome to Naval Base Coronado," Martinez began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had given this speech hundreds of times. "You've completed basic training, which means you know how to follow orders and work as part of a team. Now you'll learn how to apply those skills in a real operational environment." He opened a folder and began reading assignments. The first recruit was assigned to communications, the second to base security, and the third to engineering. When he reached Sarah's file, Martinez paused and frowned slightly. "Mills, Sarah. Retail background, college degree in business administration, scored high on technical aptitude tests." He looked up at her with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "You've been assigned to base maintenance, night shift, effective immediately." Sarah felt the other recruits' sympathetic glances, but she maintained her composure. Base maintenance night shift was typically reserved for disciplinary cases or personnel who had somehow fallen out of favor. For a new recruit with strong test scores, it was an obvious punishment assignment. "Is there something wrong with my file, Chief?" Sarah asked, injecting just the right amount of confused disappointment into her voice. Martinez glanced toward the door, then back at her file. "Assignment came down from operations. Lieutenant Commander Webb specifically requested you for this detail." His tone suggested he disagreed with the decision, but wasn't in a position to challenge it. "I see," Sarah replied. "When do I start?" "Tonight. Report to Building 7 at 2000 hours. Petty Officer Collins will brief you on your duties." Martinez handed her a sheet of paper with basic information about her assignment. "Any questions?" Sarah scanned the paper quickly. Building 7 was the base maintenance facility, and her duties would include cleaning equipment, organizing supply rooms, and performing basic repairs under supervision. It was exactly the kind of mind-numbing work designed to break the spirit of ambitious personnel. "No questions, Chief." "Thank you." As she left the personnel office, Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. Webb's move was so transparently vindictive that it would be easy to document as part of his pattern of abuse. More importantly, the maintenance facility would give her access to areas of the base that most personnel never saw, including storage facilities where stolen supplies might be hidden. She had the rest of the day free before her night shift began, so Sarah decided to explore the base and begin mapping Webb's operation. She started with the commissary, where she overheard two sailors complaining about chronic shortages of basic supplies despite full funding allocations. In the base exchange, she noticed that certain high-value items were frequently out of stock, though the manager seemed evasive when asked about delivery schedules. Her most revealing discovery came when she walked past the secondary warehouse that Webb had mentioned the previous evening. The building was located in a relatively isolated section of the base, surrounded by a fence that seemed more robust than necessary for normal storage. Through the chain link, she could see several civilian vehicles parked inside the compound, which was unusual for a military storage facility. Sarah positioned herself at a nearby bench and pretended to read while observing the warehouse activity. Over the course of an hour, she watched as personnel in civilian clothes loaded boxes from the warehouse into unmarked trucks. The operation had the efficiency of a well-established routine, and none of the participants seemed concerned about being observed. She was mentally cataloging license plate numbers when a shadow fell across her book. Looking up, she found Lieutenant Thompson standing beside the bench with an expression that was half curiosity and half suspicion. "Enjoying your reading, Mills?" Thompson asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Yes, sir. Just trying to familiarize myself with the base layout before tonight." Sarah held up a base map that she had picked up from the information office. Thompson's eyes flicked toward the warehouse, then back to her. "Maintenance duty, I heard. That's rough for someone with your educational background." "I'm sure I'll learn a lot," Sarah replied evenly. "Every job in the military has its purpose." "That's a good attitude. Very mature." Thompson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Word of advice, though? Some areas of the base are off-limits to unauthorized personnel. Wouldn't want you to wander into somewhere you shouldn't be and get yourself in trouble." "Of course, sir. I'll make sure to stay in authorized areas." "Good. See that you do." Thompson glanced around the area once more before walking away, but Sarah noticed that he used his radio to communicate with someone as he left. The interaction confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Webb's people were already watching her closely. Thompson's warning about unauthorized areas was clearly meant to keep her away from the warehouse and other locations where Webb's operation might be visible. The fact that they felt the need to warn her so quickly suggested they were nervous about something. Sarah returned to her quarters and spent the afternoon reviewing technical manuals related to base maintenance, both to prepare for her assignment and to maintain her cover. She also used her secure communication device to send another coded report to Morrison, detailing the warehouse operation and Webb's suspicious behavior. At 19:30, she made her way to Building 7. The maintenance facility was a large, industrial structure filled with equipment ranging from cleaning supplies to sophisticated repair tools. The night shift crew consisted of 8 personnel, most of whom had the worn-down appearance of people who had been assigned to punishment details. Petty Officer Collins turned out to be a career sailor in his 50s who seemed genuinely dedicated to his job despite the circumstances. He was professional and thorough as he explained Sarah's duties, showing her how to operate the various cleaning equipment and pointing out the storage areas where supplies were kept. "The work isn't glamorous," Collins said as they completed the tour, "but it's important. A clean, well-maintained facility operates more efficiently and safely. Don't let anyone tell you this job doesn't matter." Sarah appreciated his attitude, and she could tell that Collins was the kind of NCO who took pride in his work regardless of how others viewed it. As the shift began, she threw herself into her assigned tasks with the enthusiasm expected of a new recruit, while carefully observing everything around her. Her first discovery came while cleaning the equipment storage room. Hidden behind a row of floor buffers, she found several boxes marked with supply codes that didn't match their actual contents. What should have been cleaning supplies were actually expensive electronic components that were certainly not intended for maintenance use. Sarah memorized the part numbers and continued her work, but her pulse quickened with excitement. This was exactly the kind of evidence she needed to prove that Webb was diverting military supplies for personal profit. The components were worth thousands of dollars and would be easy to sell on the civilian market. Around midnight, as she was mopping the main corridor, Sarah heard voices approaching from outside. She quickly moved to a position where she could observe without being seen and watched as Webb himself entered the building with 2 other men she didn't recognize. "The next shipment is twice the size," Webb was saying to his companions. "We'll need to process it quickly and get it off the base before the morning inventory." "What about the security cameras?" asked one of the men. "Handled. Collins thinks they're broken, and the requisition for replacement parts got lost in paperwork. We've got at least another month before anyone bothers to fix them." Sarah felt a surge of anger at how casually Webb discussed manipulating maintenance schedules for his illegal activities. Collins was an honest sailor doing his best with limited resources, and Webb was exploiting that dedication for criminal purposes. The 3 men moved toward the storage area where Sarah had found the hidden components. She waited until they were out of sight, then carefully positioned herself where she could overhear their conversation. "The electronics move fast," Webb was explaining. "Military-grade communications equipment has a ready market with civilian contractors who don't ask questions about provenance. The profit margin is excellent. What about the audit risk? Minimal. The official inventory shows equipment delivered to various departments across the base. By the time anyone realizes specific items are missing, they've been listed as damaged or obsolete for months. Perfect paper trail." Sarah listened as Webb outlined a sophisticated theft operation that had apparently been running for years. He had identified high-value, low-visibility items that could be stolen without triggering immediate notice, created false documentation to cover the theft, and established sales channels that converted military equipment into personal profit. When the men finished their inspection and left the building, Sarah waited several minutes before emerging from her hiding place. She needed to document what she had found, but she also needed to be extremely careful not to alert Webb's people to her activities. Using her phone's camera, she quickly photographed the hidden components and their mismatched labels. She also noted the specific location and arrangement of the boxes, so she could prove they had been deliberately concealed rather than simply misfiled. As she returned to her cleaning duties, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The evidence she was gathering would be enough to launch a formal investigation, but she wanted to map the full extent of Webb's operation before revealing herself. The more complete her intelligence, the less chance that any of his associates would escape justice. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but Sarah remained alert for additional signs of illegal activity. She noticed that certain storage areas were locked with non-standard padlocks, and several rooms were marked as containing hazardous materials despite showing no signs of proper safety protocols. When morning came and the day's shift arrived, Sarah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Her first night in Webb's punishment assignment had yielded more intelligence than she had hoped to gather in a week. Webb's operation was extensive and well-organized, but it was also growing careless due to years of operating without oversight. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah passed several of Webb's associates in the corridors. She could see them watching her, evaluating whether she posed any threat to their operation. Their scrutiny would only intensify as time passed, which meant she needed to gather evidence quickly while maintaining her cover. But Sarah felt confident about her progress. Webb had made the mistake of placing her exactly where she needed to be to document his crimes. His attempt to break her spirit with punishment duty had instead given her unprecedented access to the heart of his operation. She was beginning to understand the full scope of the corruption at Coronado, and it was worse than anyone had suspected. Webb wasn't just stealing supplies or manipulating duty rosters. He was running a criminal enterprise that perverted every aspect of military operations for personal gain. Soon, very soon, Sarah would have enough evidence to destroy him completely. But first, she needed to identify all of his associates and map every aspect of his network. When she struck, it would be with overwhelming force that would leave no survivors to continue the corruption after Webb was gone. The new girl they thought they could intimidate was methodically building the case that would end their careers and send them to prison. And they had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks into her assignment, Sarah had established a routine that gave her maximum access to intelligence while maintaining her cover as a demoralized recruit. She reported to the maintenance facility each night at 2,000 hours, worked diligently at her assigned tasks, and gradually expanded her knowledge of Webb's criminal network. The pattern of harassment had escalated exactly as she had expected. Webb's associates ensured that she received the worst equipment, the most difficult assignments, and constant criticism regardless of her performance. Petty Officer Collins had quietly apologized for the treatment, explaining that orders had come down from operations to keep Mills busy and miserable. Sarah played her role perfectly, showing signs of frustration and disappointment that satisfied Webb's people while never quite breaking down completely. She complained just enough to seem realistic, but not enough to provide them with grounds for formal disciplinary action. The balance required careful calculation, but it was exactly the kind of psychological warfare she had learned during her years in command. Her investigation had revealed that Webb's operation was far more extensive than initial reports had suggested. The corruption went beyond simple theft and had evolved into a comprehensive system of military fraud that touched every aspect of base operations. The supply chain manipulation was the most sophisticated element. Webb had identified dozens of high-value items that could be diverted without triggering immediate notice. Electronics, spare parts, medical supplies, and even fuel were systematically stolen through false documentation and modified inventory records. The goods were then sold through a network of civilian contacts who had established legitimate-seeming businesses specifically to launder military equipment. Personnel assignments were manipulated to ensure that honest sailors were kept away from sensitive positions while Webb's associates controlled key checkpoints in the supply and administrative systems. Duty rosters were modified to provide his people with unsupervised access to storage facilities during off hours. Even the base security protocols had been compromised, with certain patrols being rerouted away from areas where illegal activities were taking place. Sarah had documented dozens of specific incidents, photographed evidence, and recorded conversations that would provide ironclad proof of criminal activity. Her secure communications with Morrison had established that naval intelligence was preparing warrants and coordinating with military prosecutors for what would likely become one of the largest corruption cases in recent Navy history. But Sarah wanted more than just evidence of theft. She was determined to expose the complete network and understand how Webb had managed to operate with impunity for so long. The answer, she suspected, lay in his connections outside the base. Her breakthrough came during her 4th week when she overheard a conversation between Webb and a civilian visitor who had arrived for what appeared to be a routine inspection, but was clearly something else entirely. Sarah was cleaning a corridor adjacent to Webb's office when the meeting took place. The office windows were partially open due to a malfunctioning air conditioning system, and voices carried clearly through the thin walls. The senator's office is asking questions about contract allocations, the civilian was saying. Nothing specific yet, but they've requested detailed documentation for the past 18 months. How much time do we have? Webb asked. Maybe 6 weeks before they expect a response. But if they don't like what they see, it could trigger a formal audit. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized she was listening to a discussion about political corruption at the highest levels. Webb's operation wasn't just stealing military supplies. It was connected to fraudulent government contracts worth millions of dollars. The contracts are clean, Webb said. We've been careful about the documentation. The problem is the physical inventory. If they start comparing delivered quantities with actual stock levels, we're going to have discrepancies. How big? Conservative estimate? About 2 million in missing equipment over the past year. Maybe more if they go back further. The civilian cursed softly. We need to clean house. Get rid of anything that can't be explained. Modify the records to show equipment transfers or damage reports. That's going to take time, and it's going to leave traces. Too many people are involved now. Then, maybe it's time to consider cutting our losses. Shut down operations, transfer the key people to other assignments, and let things cool down for a while. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. Webb's operation was connected to fraudulent government contracts, which meant the corruption extended beyond the military and into the civilian political system. The mention of a senator's involvement suggested that elected officials were either complicit or being manipulated by Webb's network. More importantly, Webb was considering shutting down his operation and transferring his associates to avoid investigation. If that happened, the criminals would escape justice and simply establish new operations elsewhere. She needed to accelerate her timeline. That night, Sarah sent an urgent coded message to Morrison explaining what she had learned. The response came back within hours. Naval intelligence was expediting their investigation and coordinating with the FBI to address the civilian connections. Sarah was instructed to gather as much additional evidence as possible while maintaining her cover, but to be prepared for rapid extraction if her identity was compromised. The next few days brought increased tension as Webb's people became noticeably more nervous and security conscious. Sarah observed several meetings between Webb and his key associates where they spoke in hushed tones and frequently glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. She also noticed increased surveillance of her own activities. Thompson had taken to appearing in areas where she was working, always with a plausible excuse, but clearly keeping track of her movements. Other members of Webb's network began asking casual questions about her background and her interactions with other personnel. Sarah realized that her time was running out. Webb's instincts were telling him that something was wrong, and he was systematically checking every potential security risk in his operation. It would only be a matter of time before he focused his attention on her with enough intensity to penetrate her cover. But she had one more crucial piece of intelligence to gather. During her weeks of observation, she had identified a secure storage facility in the base's most remote section where Webb's people conducted their most sensitive operations. The facility was heavily secured and accessed only by Webb's inner circle, which suggested it contained either high-value stolen goods or documentation that could expose the full extent of the network. Sarah knew that gaining access to the facility would be extremely dangerous, but the intelligence value was potentially enormous. If she could document what was stored there, it might provide the final evidence needed to dismantle not just Webb's operation, but the entire corruption network, including its political connections. She spent several days observing the facility's security procedures and identifying patterns in the guards' movements. The building was protected by electronic locks, security cameras, and regular patrols, but Sarah had noticed that the system had vulnerabilities. The cameras were older models with predictable sweep patterns. The electronic locks used outdated technology that could be defeated with the right equipment, and the patrols followed routes that left brief windows of opportunity for someone with the proper training. Sarah's years of naval service had included extensive training in security procedures and intelligence gathering. She knew how to defeat most standard military security systems, and she had access to specialized equipment hidden in her personal belongings that would allow her to bypass the facility's protections. The risk was enormous. If she was caught inside the facility, there would be no way to explain her presence or maintain her cover. Webb would immediately realize that she was an undercover investigator, and her life would be in serious danger. But the potential reward justified the risk. The intelligence she could gather might prevent Webb and his associates from escaping to establish new operations elsewhere. It might also expose the civilian connections that were enabling military corruption on a massive scale. Sarah decided to make her attempt during the following weekend, when base activity would be reduced and fewer people would be around to notice unusual movements. She began preparing by studying the facility's layout, gathering the equipment she would need, and planning multiple escape routes in case something went wrong. She also prepared for the possibility that this might be her final intelligence-gathering mission. If Webb discovered her true identity, she would need to abandon her cover immediately and rely on naval intelligence for extraction and protection. The carefully built case against Webb's network would have to proceed based on the evidence she had already gathered. But Sarah was determined to see the mission through to completion. She had spent weeks watching Webb and his associates abuse their military authority for personal gain while honest sailors suffered under their corrupt leadership. The thought of them escaping justice to continue their crimes elsewhere was intolerable. On Friday evening, as she completed another night shift at the maintenance facility, Sarah made her final preparations. She reviewed her intelligence one more time, checked her specialized equipment, and sent what might be her last coded message to Morrison. In it, she outlined her plan and requested that naval intelligence be prepared for rapid intervention if her infiltration was discovered. As she walked back to her quarters through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the familiar tension that preceded high-risk operations. She had conducted similar missions during her years as a naval officer, but those had been against foreign adversaries in distant locations. This time, she was operating against corrupt Americans on a U.S. military base, which added layers of complexity and legal constraints that made the mission more challenging. But she was confident in her abilities and determined to succeed. Webb's network had operated for years with impunity because they believed themselves untouchable. They had grown careless and arrogant, which would be their downfall. Tomorrow night, the new girl they had tried so hard to break would strike back with devastating force. And when she was finished, Webb's criminal empire would be nothing but evidence in a federal courtroom and memories of how quickly the mighty could fall when they finally faced real opposition. The endgame was approaching, and Sarah Chun was ready to remind everyone why she had become one of the youngest admirals in naval history. Webb and his associates had made the fatal mistake of underestimating their opponent, and now they would pay the price for their arrogance. Saturday night arrived with a thick marine layer that provided perfect cover for Sarah's infiltration mission. The fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean reduced visibility across the base and muffled sounds, creating ideal conditions for covert movement. Sarah had spent the day maintaining her normal routine, appearing in the mess hall and common areas just enough to establish her presence without drawing attention. At 2,300 hours, she slipped out of her quarters wearing dark civilian clothes and carrying a small backpack containing her specialized equipment. The tools she had hidden among her personal belongings included electronic lockpicks, camera jammers, and communication devices that would have raised serious questions if discovered during a routine inspection. The secure storage facility was located in Sector 7, a remote area of the base that housed fuel storage tanks, equipment maintenance shops, and other industrial facilities that operated primarily during daytime hours. Sarah had memorized the route during her weeks of observation, identifying checkpoints, camera locations, and patrol schedules that would allow her to reach the target building undetected. Moving through the fog-shrouded base required all of her training in covert operations. Sarah avoided areas with motion sensors, stayed in shadows between security lights, and timed her movements to coincide with the predictable patrol patterns she had observed. The marine layer that reduced visibility also dampened sound, but it worked both ways. She needed to be even more careful about noise discipline because any sound would seem amplified in the muffled environment. The first checkpoint was a security camera mounted on Building 15 that covered the approach to Sector 7. Sarah had observed that the camera followed a programmed sweep pattern that left a 30-second window every 4 minutes when the approach was not monitored. She waited in concealment until the camera began its sweep away from her position, then moved quickly across the exposed area. The second obstacle was a roving patrol that followed a route through the industrial area every 20 minutes. Sarah had timed the patrol precisely during previous nights and positioned herself behind a fuel storage tank as the security vehicle passed less than 50 feet from her location. The guards were following their routine without particular alertness, which suggested that covert infiltrations were not considered a serious threat. As she approached the target building, Sarah could see that its security was more sophisticated than the rest of the base. The structure was surrounded by a double fence topped with razor wire, and she could identify at least 6 cameras providing overlapping coverage of the perimeter. Electronic sensors were mounted on the fence itself, and motion detectors covered the area between the inner and outer barriers. The building itself was a concrete block structure with no windows and a single entrance protected by electronic locks, and additional cameras. Sarah could see that anyone attempting to enter would need to defeat multiple security systems while remaining undetected by the various sensors monitoring the facility. But Sarah had identified a vulnerability during her reconnaissance. The building's ventilation system required an air intake mounted on the roof, and the intake was connected to the building's interior through a maintenance shaft that bypassed most of the security systems. The shaft was too small for most adults, but Sarah's compact build would allow her to use it as an entry route. Reaching the roof required defeating the perimeter security, which Sarah accomplished using techniques she had learned during advanced intelligence training. The electronic sensors on the fence operated on a frequency that could be temporarily disrupted using a small jamming device, creating brief windows when the system would not detect physical contact with the barrier. Sarah activated the jammer and quickly climbed the outer fence, moved across the space between barriers during a gap in the camera coverage, and scaled the inner fence before the electronic systems reset. The entire process took less than 2 minutes, and she was concealed behind the building before any alarms could activate. The air intake was located on the building's north side, away from the primary camera coverage. Sarah used a portable drill to remove the intake cover and examined the maintenance shaft beyond. The passage was narrow and would require crawling, but it appeared to provide access to the building's interior without triggering additional security measures. She activated a small camera jammer that would create temporary blind spots in the building's internal surveillance system, then entered the maintenance shaft. The passage was cramped and uncomfortable, but it led directly into the building's main storage area through a ventilation grate that could be opened from inside. When Sarah emerged into the storage facility, she found herself in a room that confirmed her worst suspicions about Webb's operation. The space was filled with military equipment worth millions of dollars, communications gear, medical supplies, vehicle parts, and electronic components that should have been distributed to various military units, but had instead been diverted for sale on the black market. The organization was sophisticated and professional. Equipment was sorted by type and value, with detailed inventory sheets that tracked when items had been stolen and when they were scheduled for sale. Sarah photographed everything she could see, documenting the scope of the theft operation and the systematic nature of Webb's criminal enterprise. In a separate section of the facility, she discovered filing cabinets containing financial records that revealed the full extent of the corruption network. Webb's operation was generating over $1 million per year in illegal profits, which were being distributed among his associates and used to bribe officials who could protect the network from investigation. The most damaging evidence was a detailed ledger that listed payments to civilian contractors, politicians, and military officials who were either actively participating in the corruption or being paid to look the other way. Sarah recognized several names of senior officers and government officials whose involvement would create a massive scandal when exposed. She was photographing the financial records when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The electronic locks on the main entrance were being activated. Someone was entering the building, and Sarah was trapped inside with no immediate escape route. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah concealed herself behind a stack of stolen equipment and listened as multiple people entered the facility. She could hear Webb's voice along with at least 2 other men, and their conversation suggested this was an unscheduled meeting prompted by security concerns. "I'm telling you, something's wrong," Webb was saying. "Too many people have been asking questions, and that new recruit Mills has been in places she shouldn't be." "What kind of places?" asked a voice Sarah didn't recognize. "Thompson saw her near the secondary warehouse last week, and Collins mentioned that she's been working extra shifts in areas where she wasn't assigned. Plus, her background check came back cleaner than it should be for someone with her employment history." Sarah's heart rate spiked as she realized Webb was discussing her directly. His suspicions had apparently reached the point where he was seriously questioning her identity, which meant her cover could be blown at any moment. "You want us to take care of her?" asked the third voice. "Not yet, but I want her transferred off the base as soon as possible. Create some kind of disciplinary incident that justifies reassignment to another installation. Somewhere far away where she can't cause problems." "What about the other concerns?" "The audit timeline is getting shorter, and we've got too much exposure here." Webb was quiet for a moment before responding. "We accelerate the shutdown. Start moving the high-value items off base immediately, and begin destroying any documentation that could link us to the missing equipment. I want this operation completely sanitized within 2 weeks." Sarah felt a surge of frustration as she listened to Webb planning the destruction of evidence that would be crucial for prosecuting his network. If he succeeded in sanitizing his operation, many of the criminals involved would escape justice and be free to establish new schemes elsewhere. The three men spent another hour in the facility, moving specific items and discussing operational details that Sarah memorized for later reporting. Their conversation confirmed that the corruption network extended far beyond Naval Base Coronado and included participants in other military installations and civilian government agencies. When they finally left, Sarah waited another 30 minutes before emerging from her hiding place. She had gathered more intelligence than she had hoped, but she was also aware that Webb's suspicions meant she had limited time before her cover was completely blown. She photographed additional evidence, including serial numbers of stolen equipment and copies of financial records that detailed the network's structure and operations. The intelligence she was gathering would be sufficient to launch prosecutions that could dismantle military corruption on a scale that hadn't been seen in decades. Exiting the building required retracing her route through the maintenance shaft and defeating the perimeter security systems again. Sarah moved even more carefully than during her entry, knowing that Webb's heightened security concerns might have resulted in additional patrols or modified sensor settings. She successfully reached the building's exterior and was preparing to scale the inner fence when she heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Two security jeeps were converging on the storage facility, their headlights cutting through the fog as they moved rapidly toward her position. Sarah realized that Webb's people had either detected her infiltration or decided to conduct an unscheduled security check that would reveal evidence of her break-in. Either way, she needed to escape immediately or face capture that would end her mission and potentially put her life in danger. Using skills developed during years of military training, Sarah moved quickly but silently away from the approaching vehicles. The fog provided concealment, but it also disoriented her navigation as she tried to reach safety without triggering additional security systems. She could hear voices behind her as the security teams discovered signs of her infiltration. Webb's voice was among them, and his tone carried a mixture of rage and determination that suggested he now understood that his operation was under serious threat. Sarah reached the edge of Sector 7 just as additional security vehicles arrived at the storage facility. Floodlights illuminated the area she had just vacated, and she could hear radio communications coordinating a base-wide search for unauthorized personnel. As she made her way back to her quarters through maintenance tunnels and service roads, Sarah knew that her undercover mission was essentially over. Webb would soon realize that she was the source of the security breach, and her life would be in immediate danger once he connected her to the infiltration. But she had accomplished her primary objective. The evidence she had gathered would be sufficient to destroy Webb's network and prosecute everyone involved. The intelligence about political connections would allow federal investigators to pursue corruption cases that could reach the highest levels of government. Now she needed to survive long enough to ensure that the evidence reached the proper authorities and that justice was finally served. The endgame was about to begin, and Sarah Chun was ready to drop her disguise and reveal exactly who Webb and his associates had been trying to intimidate. The new girl was about to become their worst nightmare. Sunday morning brought chaos to Naval Base Coronado as Webb's security forces conducted an intensive search for the infiltrator who had breached their secure facility. Sarah watched from her quarters as teams of personnel swept through buildings, questioned night shift workers, and checked security footage from across the base. She had spent the early morning hours transmitting her intelligence to Morrison through the secure communication device, uploading photographs of stolen equipment, financial records, and the detailed documentation of Webb's criminal network. The evidence package she sent was comprehensive enough to support immediate arrests and federal prosecutions. Morrison's response was swift and decisive. Naval intelligence had coordinated with the FBI, and arrest warrants were being prepared for Webb and his key associates. A joint task force was mobilizing to execute simultaneous operations at multiple locations, including civilian businesses that had been laundering the stolen military equipment. But Sarah's immediate concern was survival. Webb's investigation into the security breach was methodical and thorough, and it would only be a matter of hours before his suspicions focused on her with deadly intensity. At 0800, she received a message to report immediately to personnel for reassignment processing. The timing was too coincidental to be routine. Webb was clearly accelerating his plan to remove her from the base before she could cause additional problems. Sarah dressed in her uniform and made her way to the personnel office, knowing that this would likely be her final performance as seaman recruit Mills. As she walked through the corridors, she observed the tension among Webb's associates and the increased security measures that had been implemented throughout the base. Chief Martinez was waiting for her with paperwork that would transfer her to a weather station in Alaska, effective immediately. The assignment was clearly punitive and designed to isolate her from any opportunity to gather additional intelligence or report her observations to higher authorities. "I'm sorry about this, Mills," Martinez said as he explained the transfer orders. "Word came down from operations that you've been having attitude problems and need a change of environment." "What kind of attitude problems?" Sarah asked, maintaining her confused recruit persona. Before Martinez could respond, the office door opened and Lieutenant Commander Webb entered with Thompson and 2 other associates. Webb's expression was cold and calculating as he studied Sarah's face for any sign of deception. "Seaman recruit Mills," Webb said, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "I understand you've been exploring areas of the base where you weren't assigned." "I don't understand, sir. I've been working my shifts and following all regulations." "Is that so?" Webb moved closer, invading her personal space in a classic intimidation technique. "Because we have reports of unauthorized personnel in restricted areas, and your name keeps coming up in discussions with security." Sarah could feel the weight of Webb's suspicion pressing down on her like a physical force. His instincts were telling him that she represented a threat, but he hadn't yet connected her to the specific security breach at his storage facility. "Sir, I've only been in areas where I was assigned to work. If someone thinks they saw me somewhere else, they must be mistaken." Webb studied her face intently, looking for any micro-expression that would reveal deception. Sarah had been trained to withstand interrogation by foreign intelligence services, and she maintained her innocent expression despite the tension building in the room. "Here's what's going to happen," Webb said finally. "You're going to pack your belongings, board a transport flight this afternoon, and disappear to Alaska where you can't cause any more problems. And if I ever hear that you've been asking questions or making reports about activities on this base, you'll find out what happens to people who don't mind their own business." The threat was explicit and unmistakable. Webb was warning Sarah that her life would be in danger if she attempted to expose his operation. What he didn't know was that she had already gathered enough evidence to destroy him completely. "I understand, sir," Sarah replied meekly. "I just want to serve my country without any problems." "Good. Chief Martinez will handle your transfer paperwork. I want you off this base by 1500 hours. As Webb and his associates left the office, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Webb's plan to remove her from the base actually played into her hands perfectly. Once she was away from Coronado, she could safely reveal her true identity and coordinate the final phase of the operation that would bring down his entire network. But as she returned to her quarters to pack, Sarah noticed that she was being followed by 2 of Webb's associates who made no effort to conceal their surveillance. They positioned themselves in the corridor outside her building and maintained visual contact as she moved her belongings. The surveillance suggested that Webb's suspicions were stronger than he had revealed during their confrontation. He might be allowing her to leave the base, but he was also taking precautions in case she attempted to contact outside authorities before her departure. Sarah realized that she needed to accelerate her timeline even further. If Webb discovered her true identity before she could safely reveal herself, the situation could become extremely dangerous. She had observed enough of his operation to know that he was capable of violence when threatened, and his associates would follow his lead without question. At 1200 hours, as she was completing her packing, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Petty Officer Rodriguez knocked on her door with an expression of concern and frustration. "I heard about your transfer," Rodriguez said. "This is garbage, Mills. You've been working hard and following orders, but Webb and his crew decided you needed to be punished for asking the wrong questions." Sarah appreciated Rodriguez's support, but she was also aware that their conversation was probably being monitored by Webb's people. "It's okay," she said. "Maybe Alaska will be a good experience." "No, it's not okay. This base has become a toxic environment where good people get crushed by corrupt officers who think they're untouchable." Rodriguez's voice carried genuine anger. Someone needs to stand up to Webb and his cronies before they destroy everything decent about military service. Before Sarah could respond, her secure communication device vibrated with an incoming message from Morrison. The text was brief but electrifying. "Operation Greenlight. Federal Task Force executing warrants in 60 minutes. Maintain cover until all clear signal. Sarah felt her pulse spike as she realized that the final phase of the operation was beginning. In 1 hour, Webb and his associates would be under arrest, and their criminal network would be dismantled by federal agents. She just needed to survive until the arrests were completed. Rodriguez, she said quietly, I need you to listen carefully. In about an hour, this base is going to be very busy with federal agents and investigators. When that happens, I want you to stay in your quarters and avoid getting involved in anything that might be dangerous. Rodriguez looked puzzled. What are you talking about? Trust me on this. Just stay safe and let the professionals handle whatever happens next. At 12:45, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching the base. Through her window, she could see several aircraft and federal law enforcement markings landing on the base's main helicopter pad. Additional vehicles were entering through the main gate, and she could observe personnel in FBI jackets moving with the purposeful efficiency of a well-planned operation. The arrests began simultaneously across multiple locations. Sarah watched as teams of federal agents moved to key buildings while military police secured potential evidence sites. The coordination was flawless, with each target being neutralized before Webb's network could mount any organized response. Webb himself was arrested in his office while attempting to destroy financial records that detailed his criminal activities. Thompson was taken into custody at the secondary warehouse where he had been supervising the removal of stolen equipment. One by one, every member of the corruption network was apprehended with evidence that would support lengthy prison sentences. As the arrests continued, Sarah's secure device signaled with Morrison's all-clear message. The immediate danger was over, and she was free to reveal her true identity to coordinate the final phase of the investigation. Sarah opened her door and found that her surveillance detail had disappeared, probably recalled to deal with the crisis that was engulfing Webb's organization. She walked calmly to the base commander's office, where she knew Morrison would be coordinating with federal investigators. The scene at headquarters was controlled chaos as agents and investigators processed evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared for the complex prosecutions that would follow. Sarah identified herself to the military police at the entrance and requested to speak with Admiral Morrison immediately. When Morrison saw her, the veteran officer's expression showed both relief and pride. Admiral Chun, she said, using Sarah's real rank for the first time in weeks. Outstanding work. Your intelligence gathering has given us everything we need to dismantle one of the largest military corruption networks in recent history. As word spread through the base that Seaman Recruit Mills was actually Admiral Sarah Chun, the reactions ranged from shock to admiration to embarrassment among those who had witnessed her mistreatment. Rodriguez found Sarah in the command center and could barely speak as she realized what had been happening. You're an admiral? Rodriguez asked in amazement. I am, Sarah confirmed. And everything you said about Webb and toxic leadership was absolutely correct. That's why I was here, to gather evidence and make sure that good sailors like you could serve in an environment based on honor and integrity instead of corruption and fear. The investigation and prosecutions that followed would take months to complete, but the immediate impact was transformative. Webb and 15 associates were charged with federal crimes including theft of government property, conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering. The civilian network that had been laundering stolen military equipment was dismantled, and several politicians were investigated for their connections to the corruption scheme. Naval Base Coronado underwent a complete leadership change, with new commanders implementing policies designed to prevent future corruption and restore the integrity that Webb's network had destroyed. Sailors who had been marginalized or punished for refusing to participate in illegal activities were vindicated and restored to positions where their talents could be properly utilized. For Sarah, the mission represented a successful conclusion to one of the most challenging assignments of her career. She had spent weeks enduring harassment and intimidation while maintaining perfect operational security, gathering intelligence that exposed corruption on a massive scale. But, more importantly, she had demonstrated that accountability still existed in the military justice system. Webb and his associates had believed themselves untouchable because they had operated for years without consequences. Their downfall sent a clear message throughout the Navy that corruption would be identified, investigated, and prosecuted regardless of rank or connections. As Sarah prepared to return to her regular duties, she reflected on the lessons of her time as Seaman Recruit Mills. The experience had reinforced her belief that leadership meant protecting those who served honestly while holding accountable those who betrayed their oath. It had also reminded her that true strength sometimes meant appearing weak until the moment came to strike with overwhelming force. Webb and his associates had tried to break down a new girl who seemed vulnerable and alone. Instead, they had given a seasoned admiral unprecedented access to their criminal operation and the evidence needed to destroy them completely. In the end, they learned what Sarah had always known, that underestimating your opponent is the fastest way to ensure your own defeat. The new girl they had dismissed as harmless had turned out to be their worst nightmare, and justice had finally been served.